it just shows you the mentality of how we think about selecting software. And actually, they should be balanced, because if it can do 4,000 things out the box, but nobody uses it, it adds no value. Yeah. So, and I'm painting that as a very, very extreme picture, but the usability is fundamentally driving the adoption of these applications.
Welcome to the Trend Detection Podcast, powered by Siemens. And now your host, Niall Sullivan.
Hello, and welcome to the latest episode of the Trend Detection Podcast. Really pleased to be joined by one of our favourite regulars. I'm going to add to that, Nick Leeder, who you'll know from many podcasts. He joined our live event a few months ago, which was also published on here. But you're back again, Nick, so welcome back. How things been?
Thanks for having me. Good. Hopefully everybody had a good summer as well. I mean, it's now's the time of rest and recuperation, really, and back into the full swing of things as we hit the final quarters or the final few months of the year.
Excellent. Yeah, same here. I have to say. But today we're talking about a very important topic, and a topic that sort of emerged over the past year, 18 months, I guess, around sort of skill shortage. Anyone industrial manufacturing space will know all about this. But we're sort of framing this episode a little bit around a blog you did for the World Economic Forum, which we can, of course, link to in the show notes as well afterwards. But maybe you could sort of just open the conversation, Nick, just explain sort of the background to the post and the background maybe to this episode as well. Like what we're going to sort of cover today.
So I guess the background was I hear the word skills shortage a lot. And it's undeniable that the workforce is aging in the manufacturing sector, and more people are retiring or coming up to retirement. And there is a real challenge of attracting the younger generations into the industry. And a lot of it is focused around, people aren't interested in manufacturing, which I kind of understand, because there's a legacy of kind of being a bit of a dirty, conceptually being a dirty industry, which isn't, it's a false idea. But actually, what I was also looking at and grappling at is, are we making it easy to attract the talent? And particularly when it comes to the applications that we use within the manufacturing working environment, ERP systems, MES, predictive maintenance technologies, those sort of things. And looking at that and going, well, are these actually helping attract talent, or actually are they a barrier for bringing these skills or new skills into it? So do we have a skills shortage, or do we have a usability crisis? I frame that question in black and white, because I think, having used many different applications over the years, I don't think it is quite black and white. I'm sure we'll go into that as we go through today's conversation.
Yeah, and attracting talent, because you'd imagine with all this new technology, AI, we know about AI, IoT, automation. Yeah. It's quite on the face of it, maybe a little bit of an outsider perspective for me. It's a really cool space to be in, but is that not reflected in reality? Let's say.
Well, cool and manufacturing kind of go together when we talk about manufacturing technology, as in the art of producing things. But cool and manufacturing doesn't really go always, because I wrote a blog a while ago saying there's no fashion in manufacturing. There's a reason why we still use PLCs from the 1980s on the shop floor, because they work and they haven't broken. And until they break, nobody's actually going to do about it. Manufacturing is about producing things profitably, safely, in the right quantity at the right time. And anything that affects risk around those things are kind of is generally not looked upon positively. So when I look at these kind of cool, and I have to do the air quotes, and I apologize for that, but cool technologies, manufacturing is not always the fastest to adopt them. And when they do, the applications I see have typically been built around an engineer thinking about the engineer's problem. So they're very complicated. And we see this in all sorts of applications. I said ERP is a great example of it. Sometimes MES, if you're an engineer in computer-aided design and product lifecycle management solutions as well, they're built for engineers. And that means that they create very long learning curves to use them. And many of the buyers actually, post purchasing these softwares, kind of regret the software decisions because they've looked at the functionality tick box, but not the usability tick box is hard enough. And that means that the implementations slow down, become difficult, and there becomes a usability debt that they create within the organization because people are actually unwilling to use the tools because we make it difficult for them to use the tools. So cool technology is great as long as the way we interface with that cool technology is equally as great. But manufacturing is slow also to adopt the cool technology.
It's interesting. I've heard that term before, that software regret. It might even been a conversation with, was it Gartner or someone like that, this term of software regret. So that's a real thing, right? Where they purchase it for whatever reason, and then the reality of the situation, or they've overlooked certain areas, which means in reality it's not quite what they thought it would be. Yeah.
Well, it's a great example. I've worked on an RFP recently for an ERP system, a full enterprise ERP system, and we are talking probably 4,000 functional requirements. Can it do this? Can it do this? And less than 50 requirements on how it does it, how it interacts with people.
Yes, that's really interesting, Nick. So you're saying usability is sort of the core of these adoption challenges at the heart. Whether it's AI, whether it's IoT, whether it's automation, it's you see it as overlooking the usability element of this is core to this issue.
Yeah, and that usability piece kind of is also emerging over time on different ways of interacting with the software. So I think first of all is making sure that the software is intuitive. And now it's a very vague, broad term, intuitive, and it means one thing to one person and another thing to another person. But actually, we have to step back and saying, what is the person trying to do with the job? Are they presented with all the information that they can do the job effectively and in a way that they can interpret without complex training and knowledge? And I think that's really, really important. And that's where I see user interfaces and user experience, here UI, UX kind of statements fall down massively. And there's some really interesting examples where companies, by the way, do it amazingly right. But at the same time, I've seen other examples where they've done it amazingly wrong as well. And I think taking that perspective of the lens of the user rather than the engineer is really, really important. And then the second thing I think is generationally, we are interacting with computers and devices in different ways. If I look at me, I still have a laptop, a screen, a keyboard, a mouse. I actually have a telephone on my desk with buttons. Not the circular dials that we used to have that rotated around, but it's a voice over IP, but it's got buttons. Modern generation, kind of live in a social media environment with interactions through mobile devices, for example. So I'm not saying this is the panacea to the problem, by the way, but what I am saying is generationally, the way we interact and process information is changing, yet we still seem to have user interfaces which are essentially an evolution from green screens. And green screen, by the way, if you're not of the generation, are how old mainframes used to. You've probably heard the term mainframe, which is goes after punch cards. But mainframes and the screens we used to have back in the 70s and 80s, that for me is early, by the way, were kind of very green fluorescent. So you only have one color, and very poor resolution. But essentially, a lot of what we have today is an evolution of that rather than completely rethinking about how modern generations are interacting. And that comes back to the whole skill shortage versus usability crisis.
And this, I guess, the question that's in my head, it might seem a bit of a strange question because we're talking about how to, the skills, skill shortage and usability, and people actually physically using various apps. But one thing that's sort of come up in various conversations I've had is around this idea that the users on the shop floor or whatever aren't necessarily the people using the app, but maybe they're looking more for vendors like Siemens or others to sort of manage the service for them. Is that something you're seeing more and more that's coming in conversations you're having?
I'm going to try. I'll need to unpick your question a little bit and ask you some questions on the basis of that, because what I see in that is from an IT or an OT perspective at times, but mainly IT perspective, there is an increasing desire to outsource, particularly as we evolve to SaaS or software as a service. So outsourcing all of that support function. But there is a bit of a trend in the industry of increasing engineering capabilities beyond that of just IT. In fact, I've been watching with great interest Accenture's Industry X practice as that evolves and how the businesses they've been acquiring. But actually, I think there is, to a degree, that, and I'm assuming that's where your question was going, by the way.
Yeah. Exactly.
I see that to a degree, but actually, if you think about it, the core of what a business does is design, make, and sell things in manufacturing. Yeah, not all industries work on that same premise, but certainly in manufacturing, you have to design, and that involves creating unique IP and solving a problem nobody else solves. Then you have a manufacturing piece, which you can do, that you can make that solution in the most profitable, efficient way and fulfill the demand of your customers effectively. And then you have the ability to sell that and actually attract those customers in the first place. Now, there are elements within those processes which are always going to be non-value add. And I think those are the ones that are ripe for AI or outsourcing to be done. Looking at having actually change analysts in the business, looking about the amount of engineering change that they're going through, that's not hugely valuable. Executing those engineering changes, finding solutions to those problems is, and I think that is, to me, mentally, where the cutoff between outsourcing and keeping things inside of the business sits.
Yeah, well, I guess it's like anything really. You have to consider, balance what's. I mean, I could talk about having a marketing context, what to outsource and what to keep, directly with, my team as an example as well. So it's sort of a comparison to make there as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
But switching back, so that was a little bit of a tangent off because we are talking about,
we're processing conversation.
Yeah, but it was just something on my mind as I was thinking about this, because of course we still, ideally, in an ideal world, you would want people using apps on the shop floor and upskilling themselves, both for their benefit, vendors' benefit, everyone's benefit, right? I think it benefits a lot of people. But I guess there's a responsibility with vendors of software, whoever it might be, to evolve their designs to think about the human beings, the users at the end of it. So maybe you could talk a little bit about that and how they can make these their softwares and platforms more intuitive to these users.
I think first of all, it's putting themselves in the shoes of the user. I'm going to be slightly pokey and assumptional in some of these statements, but I can be shot down, and I'm happy always to be shot down when I'm incorrect. But it'd be interesting to look at the major software vendors in the industrial space and actually look at their product development teams and the guys that actually build, or the people that produce the UIs and the UXs. How much time have they actually spent with end users on the shop floor, understanding what they're doing and how they're using it? I'm sure they've got the data in terms of how they use the application from afar, but there is a gap between kind of movement of mouse, if you want to call it that, whilst using the application, and actually fundamentally understanding what an operator is doing and the decisions that they need to make and the time frames they need to make those decisions in. And I think that really fundamentally changes the game, because if you can switch from theoretical design to actually almost going back to square one and saying, what is it you're trying to do? I mean, a really good example is often with projects, we replicate the reports that exist today. What we don't do is actually go back and say, what decisions are you looking to make from these reports and when? And then you'll actually find if you switch that question, I guess 50% of the reports that are produced aren't actually used. And the remaining 50%, only kind of 10% are actually fit for purpose. The other 40% are probably people having to look at that and then reinterpret the data from those reports. And user interfaces are no different. So I think, we really need to look at this critically and say, what are the decisions people are making and how do they make it? And with the advent of things like AI, we can actually use this predictive position to provide much more contextualized and intuitive information to the user rather than having that linked behind tables and complex screens.
Yeah, and that's we mentioned AI already a few times, but Gen AI as well, because I completely take that point on board. And I think, as the example with Senseye, and I think of it from my point of view, is like, I'm not someone who works in industrial manufacturing environment, but when I see the evolution of the app from, you log in, cases are raised, you can see graphs and plot, what's happening, what trends are happening and why. But now we've got Gen AI where it's actually providing that contextual information. Do you see, it's a long way of asking, do you see, this sort of in written form and easy to understand natural language is going to help bridge this gap? Bring we're talking about today.
Yeah, potentially, because I'm a visual learner. So, you give me four kind of extremes. One being a written report, one being a chart, one being simple red, amber, green, and something where I'm able to ask a question. There's a sliding scale of capability there and way that I can interpret information. But interestingly, Gen AI, unless it produces the chart, because visually you can see and understand chart data very, very well, which you could probably never see in a table. So whether Gen AI gives you the answer is, how are things trending over time? The best one is red, amber, and green, and then that allows you to go deeper into the analysis. So the Gen AI piece could be potentially very, very powerful, but all those statements rely on a trust in data. And what we still, I think, have fundamentally is that reports, let's face it, Excel, we tend to trust that more than what AI is telling us. So I think fundamentally is, and this is interesting conversations I do have with manufacturers currently, is they're looking at AI, they're not looking at creating a solid data and contextualized data component before jumping into the AI question. And actually what you're going to have is the classical sewage pipe problem is, depending on what you put in, you get out. So I think there's huge potential. But in manufacturing, I believe still we have that data question to solve and contextualize data, because sometimes the data without that context, looking at the energy usage of a motor without actually knowing what you were producing at that time can be very false data. Vibration, using that. So the data points and relevancy coming together. And that's where AI could be incredibly powerful, but we need to get that contextualized.
Yeah, it's something we often say. I mean, it's interesting you mention Excel, because it is amazing how, probably still amazing, because you can't make presumptions about, what tools or whatever people use, but there is still quite a large majority still use Excel, right? And is that due to a lack of trust in not just AI, but just talk about pre-AI software, systems themselves, and this is the tried and trusted way? Is that sort of the mindset that's maybe holding back embracing some of these technologies?
So number one is where I see Excel being used is because there's a gap in the information they need to make decisions. So we go all the way back to what I talked about. Do we understand the decisions people need to make? And that's genuinely why a lot of people use Excel. It's actually, bizarrely, whilst being quite a complex user interface, something we've all grown familiar with. And we all know that in every business, there are people who can just basically do mathematics in Excel. There are slightly, let's call them advanced users that can use VLOOKUPs and things like that. But then you get these other people who are amazing. They do pivot table calculations. They are able to answer questions that nothing else is answering. And they can uniquely play for it. This is, I guess, where Excel probably, no pun intended, where Excel excels is. I used to work with somebody, a VP of markets in a company, and they used to talk about the sniff test. Does it pass the sniff test? And with things like Excel, you can go and interrogate the data so that you get a confidence, that it's passing the sniff test. So I think also that you kind of, I think is why it's used. It can answer questions that aren't being answered, which goes all the way back to the usability question at the beginning. But also it allows you to interrogate the data to make sure that your confidence gets high enough. And again, let's call that the sniff test for want of a better description. That, I think, is another fundamental component is trust.
Yeah, I mean, my next question was really going to be around, how do you build trust in these systems? Yeah, that's the key, isn't it? To all of this we're talking about, as well as usability, making it easy to use and intuitive and all that kind of thing. But ultimately, you can find something really intuitive, but if you don't believe what's there and it's telling you the right things, then again, it's not going to do anything, right? In that respect.
Yeah. So I guess there's an interesting scenario when you look at kind of IT organizations, and a huge amount of effort is placed into enterprise architecture. And that is looking at how all the applications sit together, integrate. But then if you look at all of that level and then drop it down to something which I call information architecture, which is almost agnostic of the applications, there isn't probably as much effort, in fact, anywhere near as much effort, actually spent looking at what defines the product, what defines a machine, what defines a good vibration, what sets the parameters around those things. How does this all plumb together and relate to each other? Again, forget about the applications. And there's not much done there. And actually that data architecture, that information architecture, I don't like using data because that's very technical, but information, how does that all fit together? How does it work together? How is it plumbed? And then how does it reside in the application? Which applications own which fleet? I think that is the part of the problem, is that kind of plumbing isn't thought through enough on an information level. Certainly is thought through on an application level, but not on an information level. And that will surface also these little islands and silos of data. And manufacturing is fantastic for this. Yeah, there will be sources of record in quality. There will be sources of record in maintenance. There will be sources of records in planning. And this all stuff isn't coming together. And the panacea of AI, quite frankly, we're decades from that yet. So we've got to kind of think how we pull this stuff together properly.
And again, I put it back to a conversation. It was a few years ago at in sort of Industry 4.0 manufacturing event when I was speaking to someone from manufacturing, large global manufacturer, and at that point they were talking about, this is before AI became the topic everywhere, but having all these little pockets of data, but now they don't know what to do with it. And it's not just what to do with the individual data, but how to bring it together and get the insights for, either individually or by bringing it together, right? So it's almost like being advised you need to collect data, you need to install sensors, get the data, and then you can know everything. But then that point, anyway, I know we've moved on. We know how far things have moved in a couple of 2 or 3 years, but yeah, I just thought that was an interesting thing to what you were saying.
And absolute manufacturing has never suffered from the lack of data. Yeah. You can analyze whatever you want, but is it the important thing? What are the important things? Again, back to that point which I raised around usability. What are the important decisions that need to be made? What is the information that supports those decisions? We don't often ask that. We go straight into analyzing all the data coming off the sensors, which unfortunately leads to a lot, particularly when AI starts coming in, leads to a lot of false positives, which then again just destroys the whole trust basis. So I think, stepping back and saying, what decisions do I need to make? And how do I present those decisions in a way that is so simple for everybody to interpret, whether that be on a HMI or on a big screen or on a mobile device you're walking around with.
But if we talk about this, I know we've probably covered silos and silo data quite a lot on this podcast, but I'm almost thinking it's even an issue, and it's not just because from a Senseye perspective, we could look at it from a lot of different ways. A plant being siloed, doing their own thing. But I think within a plant, there's probably a line over there, a line over there, a line, all collecting data in different ways, and not bringing it together from even that perspective, right? Is what we're talking about.
Yeah, it's like a Russian doll, isn't it? You kind of keep opening up, and there's another silo within the silo. And even down to the fact that an operator will either have their own Excel sheet or some notes that they walk around with in their pocket that tell them how the machine works. It is that level, and it's not a unique thing to manufacturing, but I just think we're particularly good at it. I think what I'm trying to say here is maybe there's 100% of information that's needed within a silo to make a decision. Apologies, hold on. I'll work out how to turn that phone off. So maybe there's 100% of data that's needed to make a decision within a silo. But when you take that silo or that Russian doll up to the bigger Russian doll it sits within, maybe only 10% of that data needs to be passed across. And then maybe only that aggregated 10% needs to be put across. So actually, rather than keep lifting up 100%, it's actually understanding what's important. And maybe, it's the classical example of, do you pull all the data from a sensor through to the cloud, or do you process on the edge and just pass the results across? Just think of it in that way might change some of the thinking in that silo, and actually maybe make people more comfortable in sharing different information across. But at the same time, as I go back to my previous points, that information architecture needs to be designed and needs to be understood how it flows.
Yeah, I like we've sort of gone down a more technical route. It's amazing how these conversations sort of flow into sort of different areas.
I was going to go back to institutional education at some point.
Exactly, it's so much. But I think it's in a way it just shows how broad the topic is, and it encompasses lots of different areas. Right, what we're talking about today is skill shortage. You can drill it down to the data side of things. Right, it's all interconnected. In a way,
it kind of is. It kind of is, but it's about how ultimately, kind of almost rewind all the way back. Information is information, but without providing that to the person that needs it, contextualized in a simple way, it's useless. Yeah. There's no point in having money in the bank if you can't access that money to spend it, and spending on the important things. And I'm hopefully that analogy works. But if we think about all the information we have is all the money we've got in the bank, you need to make it available to the people that need to make those decisions. And there's a time element to this, because often some decisions need to be made in real time or as close to real time, because that statement is always slightly misleading. So as close to real time as possible in the operating environment. And probably needs to be presented in almost a Boolean type way. do this, or this is going wrong. So they don't have to get the data and interpret it because the time horizon for the decisions is low. All the way through to monthly performance reporting. And that data is running on a different cadence, but is summarized up. So it's the way it's presented, how it's presented, and the time frame in which those decisions need to be made. That's a lot more thinking, I think, needs to be done in user interfaces. And when I've seen things done really well, that stuff's been taken, several layers in. It's presenting that information in a very, very intuitive way. So you don't have to go through complex training to understand what you need to do with that information. But secondly, I've seen a lot of companies do wrapping gamification around this, which drives interaction, which drives performance around these things, and actually drives visibility of how people are using this information. So, as I'm looking at this, the way that user interfaces evolve is there's a massive road we've still got to go down.
And, like you said, if they, in that ideal scenario you just described, and there's a key word you mentioned as well, change, which is ultimately what we're, change of mindset, change of process, change of workflow. But does that really enable, it's only one element of it, I guess, of the change required, but it's obviously a key element, right?
Yeah, I've spoken in webinars and before around change and making sure that change is relevant to the person. I see change often coming down as we need to change this because it will help us improve our operating margin by 3%. That means nothing to nobody on the shop floor, yeah? So when we talk about change, we make it relevant to the person the change is being impacted in. We speak to them in their language so they understand how it will benefit them, which inconsequently will benefit the company. So with all these things about user interfaces, new applications and stuff, these, if it's done right, that benefit to them and why they want to use it is actually that you start reducing the barrier to that. And you start making it easier for them to adopt what you're trying to deliver.
No, really good. No, that makes a lot of sense. Again, based on a lot of conversations I have as well. Again, another key phrase: removing barriers. Right, that's what ultimately we're doing at whatever stage of that process, from initial vendor selection to implementation and hopefully success. It's you want to remove those barriers along the way.
And I think there's a fundamental, as part of that, there's a design philosophy that needs to change. Currently, user interfaces and user experiences are engineer first, operator second. Even if that interface is geared at an operator, it's been designed by an engineer. So let's switch that equation. For the interfaces, it should be led by the people needing to use that. That could result in quite complex, not complex, but quite different user experiences. So if we took an operator first perspective on the information and the screens that the operator needs to work at, that undoubtedly would look very different to the screen that the engineer needs to use to do their work, or the planner needs to do their work, or the maintenance manager needs to do their work. But it's been thought through the lens and because you've sat, or the ends of the end user, because you've sat in their shoes and understood what they did. The downside, by the way, for a software vendor is that's probably adding cost on their side.
Yeah, something for everyone to consider there.
Yeah. That's what I'm saying. It's not a panacea, by the way.
No, absolutely not. But yeah, I guess as we come towards the end, people who listen regularly will know I always say one final question, then another three pop up. But I'm going to try and make this a final question. It's quite it's an interesting one because it's sort of put you a little bit on the spot and looking into the future as we like to do. But it's how can manufacturers? We've talked a lot about what vendors can do in terms of design. We've talked a little bit and balance that with what manufacturing leaders can do. But how can they future-proof their workforce? To enable this technology and use it, to really drive success within their organisations. It's a big question. I know.
It's a big question, which I'll try ultimately to distill down. So first of all, make sure that the voice of the worker, the operator, the people, and I'm putting it in the operator's context, but actually there are many, as I mentioned, many different roles here, but make sure that they have a voice in when you're selecting and building and designing how these tools are going to work. And I guess to start with, let's start with a practicality. Let's design not for the workforce you have today and the workforce you will have in the future, and not the workforce you used to have, which is obviously UI kind of a little bit historical. So, and try and get it so that if you change things, they can use it this quarter, not in a year's time. So there's a speed piece where you can start making big improvements. And then once you get that usability and, think about, well, do I need to train people, or is it that intuitive that they get? Looking at FFT charts and trying to put run speeds in there and all that stuff, that is not an intuitive world for an operator. It might be very intuitive though for a VA, vibration analyst. So, again, that word intuitive is subjective to the user that's using it. But then think about it from a learning point of view. And that, trying to bring this full circle, if that starts becoming intuitive and can be delivered in multiple ways, let's think of a handheld device. I'll say mobile phones. We've always got a safety component here that we've got to consider. And I hear the word wearables a lot, by the way. I believe wearables can be massively impactful, but I haven't seen it in scale, and I haven't seen it in a manufacturing environment yet at scale. I'd love to be standard corrected and invited to go and see that stuff. But if you can think about how it gets delivered and it starts to be intuitive and it starts to become, gamification, starts to engage people in a different way, then I think we start addressing perhaps the start of that skills crisis as well, because more people get attracted to working in those industries. It becomes more familiar, and you shorten the time from bringing them on board to the point they start adding value. And that is, a metric which a business will see very important. But for an individual and their morale, if they can quickly get up to speed and add value, that's actually really, really important for them, because they feel like they're doing something productive. And they may not see it, they may not notice it, but from a psychological point of view, you're doing something without having somebody hanging over your shoulder all the time. And that's a massively important thing to retain the new talent you bring in as well.
Yeah, I sort of like that. The way I positioned it in my mind, sort of shortening the time to value as well. Because maybe that's something else that, maybe it's more of a question. I told you there'd be a follow-up question, but the issue, sometimes you look at technology and oh god, it's going to, I've got these other projects, and is it going to take a while to roll out and stuff, or how long is it going to take before you see return on investment? These are the kind of questions that sometimes go around, and maybe sort of create hesitancy.
Let's face it, ROI models are written during the project creation, are theoretical, and are incredibly, incredibly difficult to prove, often financially. Absolutely, because there's assumptions. A lot of ROIs are avoidance of cost rather than reduction of cost. Particularly in the world of maintenance, it's an insurance liability you're running rather than a policy. Sorry, that you're running, not liability, but insurance policy you're running. So I get the ROI, but we can measure ROI in many different ways. We can measure ROI in actually people using the system, engaging, interacting with it, and that data becoming richer. So the next set of data that we have is more contextualized, it's more complete. More importantly, it's trusted.
And there's that word again, trust. And what a good way to end on that very, very strong statement. But yeah, so we've covered a lot. Like I said, it's a topic that goes into lots of different areas. It's even probably creating spin-off areas for us to dive into at a later date as well, Nick. But for today, thank you for your time and sharing your expertise. Again, we'll share the World Economic Forum blog in the show notes. Is there any other resources that on this topic? I mean, if there are, we could link to them as well, of course, because there's, like I said, it's quite a broad topic, lots to cover as well.
And it always go to my website, and Beyond the Buzzwords blog. There is tons of stuff for mid-sized manufacturing businesses, particularly when it comes to things like AI and actually how do you actually start interpreting it. It probably pulls on a lot of the thread and a lot of the points I've talked about today as well.
Fantastic. Well, thank you again, Nick, for your time. And thank you, everyone, for joining us for this episode. And we'll see you on the next one. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Please like and subscribe on all major podcast channels and find out more about Senseye Predictive Maintenance at Siemens.com.